everyone. It is season 4, episode 24. In Canada, we call that a 2-4 of the Hall of Fame show. And I've got a special guest. Along with myself, Kirk, Buchner, and Evan Nolan, we run NotInHallOfFame.com, the Fictitious Athlete Hall of Fame, the Fictitious Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the United States Athletic Hall of Fame. We're going to promote that again at the end of the show because we are going full gear on this one. Check this out, www.nothalloffame.com/USA, and you can be a part of whoever is going to be of the United States Athletic Hall of Fame. And it's not just Evan and I who came up with this. Well, we did come up with this, but we got Olympians, we got former Pro Bowlers, we've got directors of crap. Well, important people of directors of athletic directors on universities. Thank you. I was eventually going to figure that out on my own. So
you did on your own. So good job.
No, I appreciate that. Yes, you're not just the greatest co-host ever. So, but yeah, so like it's something that we hold near and dear to our hearts. So please vote on that. But tonight we're talking about the Pro Football Hall of Fame, which today announced the senior class or the senior finalists. And I wanted to bring in a host or a third co-host today. Someone who is the co-host of the Retro Football show that I do, and we're going to be recording another show tomorrow, although this one will come out way earlier than the one we're doing tomorrow. It's Paul Lawrence, and Paul, your Twitter handle is?
Pro Football Hall of Fame Canton guy.
So basically, if Paul doesn't know something about the Pro Football Hall of Fame, you asked a stupid question. I truly believe that. So Paul's going to help us out as we just go right to the main event, which is the 3 people who have been decided today, as we're recording this, for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We'll just get into the first one, who I think all 3 of us are very excited about, and that's from the Denver Broncos, Randy Gradishar.
Yeah, I mean, a guy that for little as we know about the process over the last few decades, we don't really know a lot of until more recently finalists and guys that are being considered. Things changed last year. A more of a formal, structured, kind of transparent process has now evolved. But even before that, he was a name that would come up quite a bit, right? A lot of people's name has a lot of advocates, a lot of football historians, fans, obviously, of the Broncos and others, and then folks who, like myself and others, who follow the Hall of Fame. I think there's a pretty good, strong consensus that he was a guy who's waited a long, long time. And when we looked at the 12 finalists that the voters were presented and discussed at their meeting and before going through their rounds of voting and picking the 3 finalists for the class of 2024, he was a guy who was at the top of most people's list, as he's well-deserving, kind of like he's done his due. He's been waiting for over 30 years. Let's elect the guy. He's deserving, and it's great to see him finally get that honor. He's been close a few times, we know. So just seeing that finally, for all these guys are getting older, of course, and want them to enjoy an experience for their family and their friends. So kudos to the voters. A really solid pick.
I also want to give a shout out to someone who Paul and I were going to be doing a show tomorrow because we're doing Super Bowl 12 on the Retro Football show. Ron Katz will be joining us. And Ron's tireless work to get Randy in there, whether that had a whole lot to do with it or not a whole lot to do with it, we don't know. But either way, we can all agree that Ron is a phenomenal guy. You had the chance of meeting him, Paul, just last month, or this month, actually.
Yep.
And I'm hoping to sort of like follow in that footstep next year. I want to be there. Evan, by the way, we're going. I'm swinging by Chicago. I'm picking you up there for that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Fine.
So
all right, cool. So no Patriots this time, but that's okay.
But I mean, I think that Ron, because like it's funny that Evan and I almost the last 4 to 5 weeks in the show, we've shouted out to Jack Silverstein for something that he wrote, and we're probably going to do it again when we get to Steve McMichael. But Ron deserves every kudos that you could possibly give. And as happy as I am for Randy, who's alive and healthy, I'm happier for Ron, just getting to know him. I'm really happy for him because I know how much it meant to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of these guys who's put a lot of passion, right, and a lot of focus. His background a little bit kind of made him a good fit. He knows how to work the media. He knows how to get his name out there. He's built a lot of connections, which is important. And the one thing about this whole process that goes through with this, you never really know who's advocating and who's making push for guys. And often it's kind of an unfair process, and you hear people talk about that. Is some of them have a so-called media machine behind them, right? That's putting that word out, that has connections in the media. The voters are largely from the media, so that can happen for a lot of these guys, but it's not consistent, right? There are franchises that don't do that for their own former players, which is kind of odd.
I
And
think
then
Ron would even say Denver did that for Randy. I
yeah,
mean, he told
yeah,
us. Yeah.
some really put the time and effort into it, others don't, or they just do a sort of a precursor, just a sort of a brief kind of push. But so you never really know. And I think, if you're a fan and you see a candidate who has a really strong case, and you know the background and you know the messaging and you know how to deliver that um, consistently across your networks and opportunities to link with media, it's a good thing to be able to have that kind of advocacy. I don't think it hurts at all if you do the right messaging, right, and you're trying to be consistent and professional about it. Not to badger voters, not to insult the voters, but hey, I'm an advocate. Do you know this? And there are several things I picked up from Ron just in the last few months of things that he's put out there. I think were picked up by others. The fact that I think Jack and I and others were trying to run the numbers, but there's a length of Super Bowls, Super Bowl one, all the way, I believe, I forget, maybe into the 80s, where every team, whether you won or lost the game,
It's all the way through. It's all the way through 2002.
yeah, so we've kind of worked, and I think Ron started some of that messaging, and then others sort of filled it in to make it more full for the longest period of time. And that's kind of a compelling, again, you want compelling new ideas, because the voters hear these guys' cases year after year. In the case of Gratishar, what is new about that? And when you talk to the voters who present these guys at the meetings, they're always looking for a new angle, a new nugget, something that I can say I haven't said before that might convince a couple voters, hey, vote for my guy, essentially. And Ron's been great at that, the messaging and the networking. And kudos to him and others who have pushed for Gratishar. Finally, it's good to see. And you're right, Kurt, somebody who has that kind of passion, enthusiasm, and puts the time and effort in. He was the first person to tell you that it's not him. It's really all about Randy Gratishar and his family. But kudos to a guy like him who's putting the time and effort in, like you guys are in many things that you do, right? Getting word about players and other folks that might kind of be forgotten or maybe not get the notoriety unless you're kind of raising a profile. So good for him.
So
oh, go ahead, Red.
Sorry, one thing I do want to say about Gratishar is it's the one person I don't think anyone was particularly surprised about at all.
Right.
If they're ever going to follow the queue, the only one of these three who technically followed the queue at all was Gratishar, because the final three, so numbers 4, 5, and 6 last year, from what we understood, if I remember correctly, were Randy Gratishar, Bob Kuchenberg, and Roger Craig. Kuchenberg,
and it was actually Sharp. Sterling Sharp was the other thing.
Sterling Sharp. I thought I heard Roger Craig, but it's okay. It doesn't matter either way. They're both in the same situation. So Gratishar got in. Kuchenberg didn't even make the final. Didn't even make the semifinalists necessarily, which is insane. And then Sharp and Craig basically in the same place, which is in the 4 to 6 range, from what I heard. So we only got one, and these other two guys we'll talk about in a second jumped out of literally nowhere to get up here, because as far as we know, neither of them have ever been discussed in the room,
and both in different ways. So maybe we should go there again, just because I'm just in awe of just Ron. I hope you're watching this. You are an amazing guy, and everything you do is full of class. I can't say enough great things about Ron Katz. I can't. It's not possible. Steve McMichael. All right, I'm sort of torn here.
Is this the Linda Ronstadt situation? Linda Ronstadt came out of nowhere, and they found out she couldn't sing anymore, and then she was elected immediately.
Yeah, but at a higher level. Okay, so yeah, Linda Ronstadt is someone who was a very big part of the 70s rock and roll scene, although didn't write anything and pretty much did everything, her bones on covers, whatever, that's fine. So did a lot of people. Steve McMichael was somebody who I wasn't on my radar, frankly. Uh, Someone who I liked a hell of a lot. I saw a lot of things. Again, here we go, Jack. Jack Silverstein put a whole great thing on that. Follow him at Read Jack. You really should. But despite everything he said, he was never somebody I was big on. Saying that, let's just get the elephant out of the room. 2 years ago, McMichael opened up on his ALS diagnosis. This year, he was a semifinalist for the first time, and Mongo is degrading fast. As a Saints fan, you're probably aware of Steve Gleason. Steve is still with us, thank God. But Mongo has degraded into that point, to the point where the last thing I saw when his wife, Kimmy, I don't remember her name, and I apologize. I should have this right. But when he was told that he's at the point where he can't talk, or he can just sort of mumble. And 2 years ago, I saw the video where he was telling Jared Payton, Walter's son, here's why I'm not going to be around anymore much, because I've got ALS. And as a wrestling fan too, because he was in pro wrestling, so I've seen bits with him and with other Bears and then other pro wrestlers. His thing is, I'm trying to think if there was anyone in the last 10 years whose ALS degradation and is as visual as this. And while I don't think that he's necessarily a Pro Football Hall of Famer, as Jack has said, if he is, let's put him in now. And during our thing that we had on Monday, as Ron said, let's show some humanity to people who are alive. And we have a bit of a combination here. And before you got on with us, Evan, Paul and I were talking. I can't think of any time I've ever seen a Hall of Fame ever sort of say, you know what, we're going to be nice in a case like this. I'll open it up here.
So the anti-Ron Santo, because Ron Santo always said, you're going to put me in as soon as I die, aren't you? And
they did.
Since he died. Same thing happened with Donna Summer in the Rock Hall. She was a finalist, four times? I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 times.
Something like that, yeah.
And then she died from complications from 9/11 years later, from the dust from that. And then all of a sudden she's in. Yeah, McMichael is someone who came out of nowhere, and he's a massive part of that Bears defense. Like, there's no question he's a massive part of that defense, but he kind of played a position where the numbers don't tell the story, if that makes sense. I still remember when Richard Seymour got in a couple years ago. Out here, Bears fans are making a direct comparison between Mongo and Richard Seymour. And the numbers on that, and I was like, well, Richard Seymour's position and Mongo's position are completely different. There was this, it's a whole separate sort of thing. That said, it is a little surprising. If he weren't sick, I don't know if he makes this jump. I'm glad they took some time to look at him. And if you're going to do it while he's alive and he's still conscious with it, cool. I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets elected and then isn't even around for the ceremony at the rate he's going. Very much Pat Boland's situation from a few years ago.
At least though Steve's aware.
Yeah, it's the first time that ever happened where somebody got elected but passed away before the actual ceremony is Pat Boland. Yeah, I have no real problem with Mongo getting in. I think that, again, it's a hard measurement, but that defense was so dominant, and I have no issues with yet another member coming in from that group. I don't know if it's Mongo. I may possibly personally have gone Duerson out of that group personally, but I don't know. It's just the way I felt about things. but I get McMichael. So
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of touched around the fringes of some of the challenges here, and I think there are so many deserving guys, right? And there's a lot, now we know more about the process this year and last year with the Hall instituting a public release and having the voters vote down to the 25, or this year it was over 30 because there were ties as semifinalists, and then down to the 12. And so we know a little bit more about how that's going. We don't have the history before that, but I think we can all be quite certain that he's never been a semifinalist or finalist as a modern candidate.
Oh.
And then he fell onto the seniors ballot, which unfortunately can happen to a lot of great players. And again, we don't know much more prior to last year's election, but it was not a name that would come up in a lot of debates and discussions. And you kind of get a sense of, like we talked about Gradishar, right? We've known for many years that he was highly a favorite of many voters, just didn't get to the threshold. And that's not the case for McMichael. But here we are. And he's got a case. And when you get to be a semifinalist and then a finalist, obviously you're getting voters who are deciding that, we're going to support this case, move him in. And, once you get a case into the room, as we say, in the room, because there's no discussion of these candidates until they're finalists, then they're presented and then they're discussed. And, throughout the history of the modern process, where we have 15 modern finalists every year, there have been guys who, when they got into that final room and had that discussion, they move quickly to election, because often people will say, we just need to get them in the room. The voters don't know these guys. If somebody can make a strong, passionate case and support that, we get the positive discussion that can happen. This is a new tier for us with the senior having that kind of structure for a couple of years. And I think a lot of us, once he became a semifinalist, could see, there's a lot of justification for the reasons we're talking about. And his, to be honest, and I know, again, I'm not griping about it, but his wife and his supporters have made his health part of the conversation. And again, I'm not being critical of that. They put that right out there, the fact that how much this would mean to him and his family while he's still aware and alive to be able to experience this. That was part of, and these guys all have campaign. There's all kinds of ways to campaign and push for players. So I'm not saying any of this is unethical or immoral. It's just they've used that as a means to raise awareness, and sometimes that's what it takes. He's probably not the first guy whose health issues have been a factor that has helped move them along in the process. But as Kurt and I were talking before, it hasn't always worked. There's been a number of players who were very old, had serious health issues, and maybe that got them a little further in the process, but did not necessarily get them elected. And those, some of those guys, unfortunately, would not be elected till after their passing. And one thing Kurt and I were kind of throwing around here, again, we're just hypothetical, that the voters are getting more sensitive and receptive, because they do get a lot of pushback about guys like Cliff Branch and Kenny Stabler, and there are others that that may or may not have had issues, or the voters may or may not have been aware of their health, but they didn't get elected. And then after they pass away, they get elected, and people feel that sort of sad and kind of frustrating event that happens. And maybe in this case, the voters are just getting a little sense of the fact, well, we have a guy publicly known with his health issues. His family's made it aware. He's got a great fan base, and he's got the credentials, and he deserves to be in the room and talked about. And he gets in the room and he gets elected. So congratulations to Stephen McMichael and his family and his fans and folks like Jack and others who've advocated for his case.
If I could, just to your point there, just when we're talking about, I keep, and Paul, you and I have talked about this, and Evan, I think you and I have too. Pat Burns. So Pat Burns in hockey, for that, when he was dying, but visually you just saw him sick, but he was still mobile. And maybe it's a different mind fuck, pardon my language here, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. Looking at Steve McMichael, who still has, God, I hope that, I know this won't sound right, but this is the way I saw it. Same size head on a body that's supposed to be had to have 250 pounds, that's now 130 or whatever it might be. Visually, it is, oh my God, compared to everything else that we've ever seen on people who were sick. It's also part of the modern media. And to your point, Paul, his wife has done a big part of that. The Bears family.
We have two speeches prepared. One if he's elected when he's alive, and one if he's elected when he's dead. That whole comment.
Yeah, but I'm going back with the whole. This is like way back before, like 40 years before, where somebody, I don't know who wrote this down, but like, why did the United States pull out of the Vietnam War? Well, because you could actually visually see it for the first time. You could see war on TV.
Right.
You didn't see anything on World War II or Korea. Here we're now seeing this. And ALS, Evan and I, we've talked about this many times. I can't think of a worse disease than ALS. I can't.
And, and we all have to be honest and frank and realistic about this. These voters are human beings, right? They're right. Compassionate. They know the game. They know the players.
Except Ron Borges. Ron Borges is a machine. I continue.
This close to a spit take.
I'll give you that one. But so it has an effect. It has an effect on all of us, right? And that's why I think our viewers probably get a sense that we're a little bit uncomfortable about raising that as an issue, because we can all see exactly what you're talking about, Kurt. And it pulls at people's, decent, compassionate human beings feel that and are very sympathetic to the situation and the horrific disease and illness that he's suffering with. The voters, you can't really expect that they're going to ignore. I mean, they're going to be affected by it, and I don't mean in a judgment or a negative way. It's just the reality of life. Yeah. And he's in the room. He's got the qualifications, great defense, 95 career sacks, testimonies from players, coaches, all that, which of course they all have. But the case is being made, and then there's that visual, I suspect, in the room, and people are thinking about that when they're hearing him being presented, and they think back to what they've seen of his condition and the publicity around that, and it's in people's minds. This isn't a computer or a machine that's making these elections. If it was, we would just do it that way, pump in all the numbers and do data analytics, and then we'd have a Hall of Fame class. But no, there's always emotion and bias and favoritism. However it plays, grudges and all this kind of thing will play into all this, and you guys know this for all the Hall of Fames that you cover. It's just a reality of these systems, and in a case like this, I think we can all set aside and realize, the voters are going to respond to that issue of his health and a terrible disease, and it's going to be a factor that's in their mind when they're thinking about, okay, I now need to vote.
I think also too, with Mongo, it's one thing if all right, this is the first person that's coming to mind. All right, let's say Matt Ryan can't speak. Matt Ryan, we don't really know what he says. Mongo is a larger than life character, so watching him unable to not just be physically out there, but now he can't talk either. It's not a shot at Matt Ryan. That was just the first name that sort of came to my mind in terms of people who just are not verbally. Yeah, okay. So I think that also plays a factor. All right, I guess
should we move on to Art Powell?
Yeah, I was just going to do that too. Thanks for that. Art Powell and Paul, you sort of
this is the biggest shock, because when I made my predictions, I said Gradishar, I said Mongo based on the situation, and then there's a third one. I was up in the air. I said Maxi Vaughn, God rest his soul. He's passed away this week. We'll get to that in a second. But Art Powell was not. I was shocked when we made the final 12. I'm even more shocked that he's here.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul. Was Powell even in the top 12 last time? I don't think so.
No. He just like McMichael, as you referred to earlier, he has never been a semifinalist or a finalist as a modern candidate, and as a senior candidate. Of course, for our viewers, the process of having semifinalists and finalists at the senior voting process, this is only the second year that's happened. But yeah, he has not really been someone who's been elevated awareness. Hey, he's being considered, sometimes those guys are considered and then drop off the list for years and then pop back up later on. In his case, no. Is he a guy that if you're on the fringes and you're digging into hall discussion and you're reading what people are talking about in a larger pool of potential candidates, was his name brought up over the past? Yes. But as far as we know, he certainly was not on the minds of the voters to the level where he made it to that 30, I think it was 30 or 31 semifinalists this year. And I think most people thought that was a huge leap, and maybe the prospects going forward would be good. And I think when we saw the 12 finalists, I think he was probably our biggest shock to say, oh, wow, he was there. And he, if you don't know his background, and he started the NFL, but he's most known for being a receiver in the Oakland Raiders and other teams in the AFL in the early to mid 1960s. And he was of the 12 finalists for seniors this year. There were 2 AFL wide receivers on that ballot, which is kind of, the AFL has sort of, been given a short stick, and there are guys there that were never voted for a long backstory we don't need to get into. But when you saw both of them, you thought they're going to cancel each other out in the next round, and they're not going to get any further. Good for them. Maybe this is good for their future prospects down the road. But I don't think anybody thought that they would suddenly rise to, a serious contender. And somewhere in this process, all of us missed. Sometimes you can see momentum and push for guys who make that finalist list. You can kind of see what's going on. You can kind of say, okay, there's folks in the media that are pushing hard and fan bases. And sometimes you get a sense of guys who are kind of rising up in that group of 12. I wasn't aware of any. I know there were people who were strong on his case, fair enough, but whether he was viewed as strong enough to be top 6, or in this case, top 3 and elected, I didn't see that. And I don't see anybody predicting it.
He's not with us, right?
No, he passed away.
No, he passed away.
Okay.
So I had Otis Taylor, the other AFL wide receiver, as my dark horse.
I had sure.
I like Otis Taylor is an interesting candidate here. At the same time, though, Powell's the 3rd leading receiver in the history of the AFL. The number, I can't remember, it's Alworth and I can't remember who the other one is off the top of my head. Are the two people in front of him are both in the Hall of Fame. So he's the 3rd leading receiver in the league. The 2 guys in front of him in the Hall of Fame. If you're going to go in order of just of that, I guess he's next in line if you're going to take an AFL receiver. From what I heard, though, the advocacy of his civil rights stances on stuff apparently had a big sway on the way people felt about this. I've already seen a couple of Twitter people talk about that Art Powell being here as the woke virus infecting everything.
Well,
I know
that's unfortunate if people are putting that label on it.
I'm saying once as soon as that came out, that's one of those things that people talk.
Well, I think Evan, you are pointing out a factor. And again, if we go back to, if you get in the room and you're one of the 12 and you're getting your case presented, they have 5 minutes, and then they can spend any amount of time they want discussing each candidate before they do the next presentation. And I think it's a question, again, that he got in the room, and however he got there, whether there was the voters got together and decided, let's push him through and get him to that level. And then when you're in the room, you had a chance to be elected, and then the case is going to be made. And I suspect what you're just pointing out was an issue I've heard a little bit since the meeting. They don't talk about the meeting. The voters are told not to talk about debates and discussion, so you get very little background. But that did come out as someone pointing out, listen, it was raised, and the importance of his role in the civil rights movement at the time in the 60s and across the NFL in dealing with many cities and athletes, right, that were still facing segregation in a lot of things like housing and issues of that nature. As a society, he was part of that, but the impact he had then in that movement within the NFL to benefit the players, the African-American players at the time, was something that people felt very strongly for. And so we assume, and I think we're pretty close to being right, it was raised. And whoever presented him with the discussion pointed that out. They're not supposed to consider anything off the field, but then somebody can make the argument, he was helping players on the field by advocating, and there's a bit of a line there, right? A bit of a thread. And hey, in a meeting like this, which is 12, you're only going to elect 3. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of a bump of somebody's profile, a little nugget, as we referred to earlier, that gets them a little more attention to the voters.
Right.
In other cases, the opposite happens sometimes, where the discussion will be find a negative in this candidate over here because I have to make a decision, and a little negative can move this person aside. But it often can be one little push.
And it could be as simple as like you said, Otis Taylor and Powell both being the AFL guys. Say Powell finishes 6th and Taylor finishes 7th. And now Powell's the only person you're considering in the top 6. Now it's a whole separate thing. You don't have the other person to compare them. Sometimes stuff like that happens. And like you said, stories. I remember a few years ago when Bryant Young was elected. And I was like, Bryant Young, out of all the people in this room, why? And like, no offense to Bryant Young. They're just, I thought, better players in the room than Bryant Young. But it was all the stories people were telling about Bryant Young, which is what pushed him on the pop. Same thing happened with Ricky Jackson. When Ricky Jackson got in the room, he was not in the room at all. Then he was in the room the first time. Then he was a Hall of Famer. It was Bryant Young's second time. So you just never know what's going to happen when you're in the room. You're right. Just get in the room and see what happens, which is why Henry Ellard at some point needs to get in the room.
Oh, look at Albert Lewis. Out of nowhere.
Albert Lewis. Yeah, Henry Ellard and Kevin Williams are my 2 people who can't get in the room. Those are my guys. I'm a Patriots fan. I'm advocating for a Ram and a Viking. But
well, that's why we love you, man.
So the other thing we found out today on the eye test for Q.
You're gonna say like who went 4, 5, 6, right?
Yeah. So
please.
It's kind of odd because last year, for both the modern and the senior and the coaches contributors, when the Hall made their press releases last year, they would tell us who made the next round. So in this case, for people watching, you start with 12. They're all discussed. They're all presented individually. They're all discussed, and the first vote down is from 12 to 6. And this year, when the results came out about the 3 that were elected, the Hall did not tell us who 4, 5, and 6, not the order, but that grouping. They don't release vote totals, so we don't know the order, but we would know that grouping of the 4, 5, 6 that made it down from 12 to 6. That did not get released actually for the coaches contributors process this year or in this senior process. However, on his podcast that was released today, Ira Kaufman, who is a voter on the seniors committee, they actually interviewed Randy Gradishar. It was great. And then towards the end, they just, Clark Judge, his co-host, who's a voter, but actually isn't on the seniors committee. He's on the coaches contributors committee. I asked Ira, like, what were your impressions of the meeting, how things go? They can't talk specifics, but they can talk generality. So they went through some of the highlights and some of what we pointed out in terms of these 3 guys and what the cases were, kind of how that went. And then he said, well, I'm going to have breaking news because I wasn't told I couldn't share this and it hasn't come out, but I'm going to say it anyways. And then, the Hall, they're not going to go after Ira Kaufman. So he did announce today, we finally found out that the 3 that made it to the round of 6 that were not elected. So if we think of a queue for next year, potentially, although the queue doesn't work very well, apparently. So the 3 guys that made that level were Roger Craig, Eddie Meter, and Ken Anderson.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't necessarily
order, or
so
no?
Sharp fell out of the 4 through 6.
And Kaufman was asked about that, and his thinking in theory. You don't know how everybody's voting. You don't see the vote. They don't see the vote totals. They don't know who's voting for whom. His thought was that the push for Powell got him through and into the 6, and it cost certainly Sharp. Sharp to fall back.
So neither Sharp or Taylor. So only the 1 wide receiver went through. So that makes sense too. There you go. That makes sense.
I think we need to caution everybody. Coming into this election, we had the same process last year, and we saw who the final 6 were, 3 that were elected and just enshrined in Canton just a few weeks ago. And we knew from last year who made that group from 4, 5, and 6. And only one of those, if there's a queue in terms of, okay, those guys are primed up, which means this year they should, have a good shot at that final 3 and get elected. Only one of them, Randy Gradishar, sort of benefited from the queue, if you want to call it that. Sharp fell
I-
back, right, as we just mentioned.
Yeah.
And so the queue didn't really work out. I think going forward, it's going to be a little bit challenging. It seems like there's 3 slots, so there's probably a top candidate who of this year's queue might be the top next year, but slots 2 and 3 could very well be like we saw this year. You don't really know until you get the 12 finalists a year from now, and who might be getting a push. And then, of course, once they're in that room, how that plays out.
Yeah, so from what I did hear, the person who had the most discussion about him in the room that whole time was Roger Craig. So Roger Craig had the longest discussion of anybody. It was almost 26 minutes on Roger Craig, which is like half a discussion we have on any of our candidates on Zoom. But Roger Craig, like the set guys from San Francisco who were in the room, so I read a couple of things on that, were very. They're like someone said, "Hey, do you have news?" It's like, yeah, it's gonna be bad news, but good for next year because of the amount of discussion. It's apparently the most discussion Craig has ever had and anything. So
Well, and
maybe,
also apparently
maybe that means
it was,
something, maybe it doesn't, but we'll find out.
and apparently it was a very I mean, I think Ira Kaufman mentioned that the discussion went on. You're right, was very lengthy for Craig, and he emphasized it was a very positive conversation, a very supportive one. Because sometimes the conversations, can often go the other way, where yeah, where there's a big, a division and grouping and a lot of I mean, I think they're all professionals about it, but the tone, right?
People voting on people
could be lengthy and negative or even neutral, which might make people wonder, like, this is just, we're not going to get anywhere. This guy's not going to get elected this year anytime soon. But in the case of Craig, yeah, I think it's worth telling our viewers that the very little impressions, we don't know specifics.
Right.
It seems like his candidacy was very well received. He's a guy who's been on the radar of a lot of people for a long period of time. From that 49ers team, the role that he played, it seems like all the cards are lined up that, again, of those 3 in the queue for next year, he's certainly a guy that looks primed. And again, there's 3 slots, right? So you put him in and you can still have, like we did this year, right? A whole mismatch and uncertainty as to who fills slot 2 and 3. But he looks well positioned for the future and well-deserved candidate.
And I know we talked about this last week, but I'm going to ask you in terms of the coach so there's a lot of discontent amongst my Patriot brethren that Buddy Parker was getting in over Bob Kraft. Again, I know we don't think of Kraft this way. Kraft is 82 years old, right? So at some point, and I know he's never spoken particularly clearly, but his words are getting more and more slurred every time he talks. So I don't know whether that's getting older or drinking too much Schaefer Light, because it's Schaefer Stadium back in the day. But it's just I'm gonna just go on record. I was on record last week that I said I thought Kraft was a favorite. If it wasn't Kraft, either was Buddy Parker. I think coming into when they created this thing, Coryell and Parker were the first 2 people everybody was thinking of. Do you agree that? I mean, I'm not shocked as Parker over Kraft. I'm guessing Kraft the next couple of years. How do you feel about the coach going in?
Yeah, I think Buddy Parker, and again, he's one of these guys, right, that was in the process for the 2020 Centennial class. Mm-hmm. And that class, in terms of seniors and coaches and contributors, was really intended to make up decades of missed service in terms of not electing deserving guys. But there was a mixed bag outcome, and there were actually more modern, recent players and coaches elected out of that. And coming out of that, some of the voters and also the non-voters who were football historians just said, wait a minute, that really wasn't what the intent was. And Buddy Parker was a guy who I think a lot of people said, when we saw the ballot for the 2020 Centennial class for the coaches, the first time coaches had their own category, by the way, is they thought, well, Buddy Parker's a shoo-in, right? I mean, he's what this was designed for, and he didn't get in. And
Buddy Parker made the mistake of being dead and not on TV.
Yeah. Well, it's not. Yeah. We won't go into that, but you're right about how that played out.
I don't have a problem with Jimmy Johnson. I just don't have a problem with Jimmy Johnson. But no offense to Bill Cowher, he was the 7th best choice.
So there's been a pretty strong concerted effort by some voters and historians like John Turney and voters like Iron Kaufman and Clark Judge and some others who really been pushing hard. And we saw the push hard for Buddy Parker in the weeks and months before that committee met a few weeks ago. And so, again, he's in the room. Will he get elected is another whole thing. But they got him in there, they made the push, and they obviously convinced some of their fellow voters that he was well deserving and had been bypassed. And even though he is also no longer with us, his case is strong and deserving and historic. And let's get this cleaned up. He's a guy who always, sometimes in this process, I look at a guy who's been on the ballot, he's talked about, we know he's deserving, just put him in and move on. Because if you don't do that, he keeps discussing. And I think getting to what you're saying early, Evan, Kraft is like, he's the next one in that kind of, we've talked about him. We know he's been close the last few years of being considered for the coaches contributor. And I think we're getting closer and closer a year to, we've talked about him. Let's just get this done. And I suspect in the next year or two, I think the only thing, and I don't know whether this is much condolence to the Patriots fans, the voters of that particular committee have gotten a lot of pushback by electing too many owners. And I'm not making judgment of the voters they put in and that, but I think a lot of people, when that category was created, viewed it as we've got some really good deserving coaches. We've got some GMs and some scouts, and some of those have been elected. But the owners also have taken up a number of the slots. And I think maybe his biggest hurdle Kraft is facing isn't his case or anything else around it. It's just this idea like, before we elect another owner, let's get, we have a backlog of coaches more than contributors, actually. Let's start whittling down that a little bit. But I agree with you. I think in the next couple of years, at some point, you'd be like, we're putting in some coaches. It's time to flip to the other side. And now there's also discussion. I don't know whether this will come to fruition, but eventually I think there's enough people pushing for the idea that rather than, still have coaches contributors, but alternate every other year. So there'll only be one coach or contributor, but elect a coach this year, for example, and then you would move to a contributor. That doesn't work today. They're all in one group. Right. But I think there's a sense that as we move forward, we deal with some of the coaches like Mike and Mike, the two Mikes, who are both very deserving, and as well as some other guys, start getting a few more coaches in, and then make sure that we're also remembering there are contributors, including owners like Robert Kraft. So I think in the next couple of years.
My thought process originally was we got a coach last year, we'll get an owner this year, and then go back to coach. But like, again, if this were ended up being, God, I don't want to disparage anyone, but if this ended up being Dan Reeves, let's just use him for example, like somebody who's like eighth on my list of people to get in, I'd have been like, what the heck? But it's Buddy Parker, who's like 1 or 2 on my list. So I'm like, okay, he's a Hall of Famer, get him in. I don't really care. I was just wondering what your thought on it. One more thing, if you don't mind, Kirk, before we move on.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you take of the lack of respect for the early age of football folks on this, right? So Al Wister, Cecil Osbell's been on here before, he's not here now. Ox Emerson has been on here before, he's not here now. Lavi Dilwig's another one who, these are all names we're talking about when we're redoing the Hall of Fame now, right? And like Ox Emerson is, I'm one of the biggest conversions on Ox Emerson. Like, I didn't know I'm like, who's Ox Emerson? The 2020 class came up because he was one of the finalists. And I'm a firm believer that he should be in the Hall, but none of the older folks, very few of them made this group of 12, and then none of them got in. What is your thought on that, or what are you hearing on that with the discussions in the room?
So you're absolutely right. Again, 2020 Centennial class was intended to fix some of that, and it didn't. And then the following elections of seniors didn't focus on the super seniors or pre-1960 guys is what we're talking about. So they've been kind of in the mix. They kind of, the last couple of years, a few of them have come up as semifinalists and finalists, but they're not getting any traction. And I think we're getting very close. And again, I've heard Ira Kaufman and Clark Judge on their podcast say this repeatedly. They said it again on today's. Well, they're getting to a point like the younger voters, or the voters who are more familiar with guys that played since the 80s, and a lot of these seniors are, and coaches and others, they're just focused on that, and they don't, maybe don't want to be too harsh, but they don't care. They're not really interested in that back history that far. They're focusing on the teams in the league that they covered. Very few of these voters are historians who have written and studied the game prior to when their media career began, and most of these guys media careers, the younger ones in the 80s or even the 90s, guys like Ira Kaufman and Clark Judge and others have been more active in terms of covering the league, but also interested in the history of it. And they're saying, listen, we have enough evidence to realize right now that the super seniors just aren't getting the respect. They're just not getting the interest of the voting. And they raised this on a previous podcast that they had with the president of the Hall of Fame, Porter, and he was receptive to the idea of going to the Hall's board probably when they, this experiment of 3 seniors a year ends after the 2025 election, and the board then has to decide how to move forward. It's kind of like a 3-year experiment. He would like to see it continue at 3 because he thinks there's a lot of guys that need to get in the room, at least to have their case discussed. That's great. But he's also leaning, and again, Kaufman and Judge have been pushing, and they mentioned again today, we need to dedicate one of those 3 slots for a period of time. Maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 4 years, and force, I'm going to use the word, force the seniors committee to pick one of the 3 from the pre-1960 super seniors. Because we know, and Evan, you've dropped some names right there. We know if you talk to historians who aren't voters, but they're active in the process, and many of the voters talk to historians like Chris Willis and John Turney and others. There's a list there. It's not 20 guys, right? It's a small list, but they're just not going to get any traction.
They're like 7 or 8 who are like,
and he may even be a bit smaller than that, but none of them, right, are getting anywhere. And we've had a centennial class, and this is the second year and letting in 3 seniors per year, and those guys aren't getting anywhere, and they're falling off the ballot. Some of them are very old, others are no longer with us, so that makes it a bit harder to make the case. And as we talked about earlier, there's nobody pushing these guys, right? Because they don't have a franchise or teammates or family members or the media who covered them, who are advocating. The media machine doesn't exist for a guy like Al Worst and Ox Emerson and Dilweg and some of the others. So they don't have the same fair advantage. And we're kind of stuck with that, and they're not going to get elected through this process. And I think more and more, some of the voters who are very concerned about the history and want these guys recognized are going to continue to push the board on that kind of let's reserve. And I think that's where we're going to end up. I don't know what year it would start. I don't know how many years, but I think we're clearly moving that model, because otherwise they're not getting in.
I'm always wondering if we end up with, at some point, baseball did the Negro League sweep up sort of situation. I mean, we're years away from this. We're like we're at year 104 for the league now, right? So we get to like year 125. I know we're like 21 years out, and like almost none of these guys have been elected. They haven't figured it out. I wonder if we end up with just some sort of big sweep of like.
So if it was me, if they asked me how to handle the super seniors, that's exactly what I would say. I would say, hey, pick a year, completely separate. You still do the modern and everything, the same process still stays. You just put together a group of historians, try to do what the centennial process class of 2020 was supposed to do, but you make an edict and you say you must go through and evaluate, let's pick a number, 12 pre-60, and we're going to let you elect, say, 6, and be done with it. Just do that thorough evaluation, the exact same model you just described that the Baseball Hall of Fame did in the early 2000s, and then clear the slate. We get them in, and it takes the onus off the voters, and like, oh, we're no more going to hear about Ox Emerson anymore, some guy who played in the 1940s. Do it right, get it done, and then move on. But I don't think
to be fair, though,
in that. But
the
would be
baseball
interested
hall,
because
though, they're looking still at those people that got left behind.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, one of the people who didn't get in was Buck O'Neill, who was the guy in charge of the whole committee. Was the one that
Second podcast in a row.
one of the silliest decisions in the history of silly decisions.
Yeah.
But
well, like I say often, there is no perfect there's no perfect
no,
system.
100%. You're gonna nobody's
But we
gonna
can do better. And
right. Kirk, what they say? Sorry, what someone say about our process with redoing the hall? They're like, we're redoing the hall and I don't like it already, is what somebody said.
Yeah. Yeah, I've already had criticism and I've already screwed up, admittedly.
Yeah, like like the criticism of how are we electing seniors when we're starting in 1946, right? So like there's no perfect way. Everyone's gonna someone's gonna be unhappy no matter what we do, but it's just a matter of making sure we get the right people in.
Yeah.
So before we move on,
my message is when I go out to everyone, it's like Kirk slightly better than David Baker, Buchner.
Nice. Last thing I want to talk about, and it's interesting because Art Powell was a member of the AFL's 1960s All-Decade team, but of the 6 seniors we've had in this situation, none have been members of the NFL All-Decade team. Art Powell was a second wide receiver on the AFL team. That used to be one of those things that you needed to have almost to get in, and it's been completely ignored over the 6th thing. Again, Art Powell, I don't think maybe that had something to do with it, but I don't know if a second team wide receiver from the AFL is really that helpful to your cause. I think that was almost coincidental. I do think that's interesting.
Powell a lot. I did not see this coming.
No, and again, I'm not dumping on Powell by any way.
No, I know you're not.
He came out of nowhere. I thought Otis Taylor was our dark horse. Turns out it was Powell, and I thought neither was getting in past Sharp. So it didn't really matter. But it's just interesting to see, like, we've heard so much about the all-decade teams for years and years and years. And now, like, Roger Craig's all-decade, he's not getting anything. Joe Jacoby, all-decade, he's not getting anything. It's an interesting thing going forward and seeing what that means.
Yeah.
Long term.
Well, and I think it's maybe the pendulum swung so far, at least on the modern side with, and even some of the more recent seniors, there was this, you had to check that box, first team, all decade, and Goslin, who's a member, Rick Goslin, was a big advocate for seniors and trying to get these guys in the room, and he put a list together of all of the first and second team all decade. It's a long list, and so it was a starting point of a conversation, which is helpful, but it is encouraging to some extent, and nice to see maybe the pendulum has shifted a little bit to the other side, because many of us will debate not a lot, but a number of the all decade selections going from the 40s all the way into the 1980s and 1990s were wrong. And there are deserving players that were missed. And there are guys on there who maybe only played the decade 1 or 2. There's some odd selections. It's not a perfect system, but it's nice to see that where the pendulum has gone the other way to realize. So Randy Gradishar is a perfect example of that. Checks all of the boxes, didn't check that one. Well, he had a 10-year career, and that was a short career, and that was a box that he didn't make. So it's nice to see it come back.
Plus, the people he's up against are Dick Butkus, Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, Ted Hendricks, Bobby Bell, and Robert Brazile.
Exactly.
I mean, that's just a stacked position in that decade. I mean, who are you taking out?
Right.
It's a tough argument. It's a tough
argument.
And
that's one of these things where you need to voters really need to look at the nuances of all the cases, right? And say, again, Randy Gradishar is really well deserving. He's not an all decade, but there's a reason why he wasn't. And it doesn't hurt. It's not because he wasn't a great player. It was there's circumstances and the competition, the limited slots. He retired after only 10 years. Media attention in West Coast versus East Coast major media markets, all those factors. It's the nuances sometimes that voters need to step back on rather than just say, does he check that box? Or he doesn't.
I'm glad you brought that up. Because when we always talk about that West Coast bias, I think for people 30 or under, you're thinking what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
But that did exist for a long time.
Well, I mean, and that happened with the seniors last year. We had 3. It was East Coast and the Cowboys are lumped in with the East Coast. So we had 3 East Coaster Cowboys this year. Powell, and I guess Mongo is the Bears, but the Bears have the most Hall of Famers of any team. So I don't know how much bias will be there. And then the Broncos. So we have 3 that don't normally fit the pattern this time. So I would like to point out, Kirk, that Drew Brees was not all decade because he couldn't bring out Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, and Aaron Rodgers.
I will be pro Drew Brees, but I will always keep it in the proper context.
Yeah, I mean, just give an idea. Sorry, you weren't all decades 2000s.
What do you mean? I'm not Drew Brees.
I'm saying whoever the quarterback is, because you didn't beat out Tom Brady and Peyton Manning.
Well, he's still going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer, and I'll be there.
Yeah. So
I'll be there.
So anyway,
or is there
anything else you want to make sure we hit, Kirk?
No, I think we should move on to the next thing. Paul, do you want to join us for our next section?
I'm going to jump off. Thanks for the invite, and great to have the conversation. I think it's always, a little retrospective to sit back and think. And many of us have been involved with this. We've talked about it over the last months and had some podcasts and discussions with our larger group. So it's always, I think, nice to kind of tie things up and kind of reflect on.
Not like I won't see you tomorrow.
That's right. And, and then in the fall, of course, get into September, October, November, we'll be into the modern process of looking at a large preliminary list in the end of September. And then usually by late November, we see the 25 semifinalists of the modern, and then late December, early January, the 15 modern finalists. And then the whole committee will meet. Maybe we should close up by reminding everybody the full committee of 50 selectors is meeting in Atlanta in person this year in mid-January. And they will go through the 15 modern and vote those down to a maximum of 5 they can elect. And the 3 players we've talked about today, plus the coach contributor finalist, Buddy Parker, will also be voted on. They are voted on individually, separately, and they still require the 80% of the 50-member board. But in recent years, and going back actually quite a while, the full 50-member committee endorses, supports, appreciates the time and effort of the committees to come up with these finalists and bring them to them. And so there is one more formality of that step that has to go before they are elected. But all of these 4 have strong cases, and I have no doubt or concern all 4 of them will be elected in January when the Hall of Fame makes their final decision. So we're looking forward to that.
20 years ago would have been in doubt. Now they realize they've screwed up and there's too much. I think that you can't, let's say Art Powell, because he was a little bit surprised, you can't send Art Powell back into the committee.
And the voters wanted 3 seniors a year because there was a lot of deserving guys, and their fellow voters are going to support that because it doesn't make any sense to the process to not elect somebody, put them back in the pool. It's happened a couple times over the last couple of decades, but in the recent years, again, they understand here's the process. These guys have been fully vetted and the committee's made the decision. So in January, I would expect that all 3 of these players and Buddy Parker will join whatever up to 5 moderns are selected, and we will have our class of 2024 for the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
I'm just waiting for the preliminary list again so we can debate whether Jake Delhomme is a Pro Football Hall of Famer. Somehow Drew Bledsoe can't make the list, who's 12.
Nor can Tony Romo, but I nominated him this year just to make sure he made it. Not that I think he's a Hall of Famer.
I don't think so either. He retired 7th in passing yards. So
if Jake Delhomme if Delhomme's on that list,
but Delhomme's on the list every single year. So
anybody can nominate any player, and that's what you get with a list of over 100. And there's guys on there that are never going to get in, but they keep showing up on that list.
I'm like, Alan Rossum again, fantastic.
All right, guys, thanks a lot.
Paul, thank you so much for coming here. I'll see you tomorrow.
All right, have a good one.
All right, take care. All right, Evan, so we are going to look at those who we've lost, and it's I don't know how big our list is.
It's fairly short because we did do this on Saturday, so last week. So I guess we'll start with music. So Ray Hildebrand of Paul and Paula, who had the 1963 #1 record, Hey Paula.
Yeah.
Remember that one?
Yeah.
So Ray Hildebrand passed away at the age of 82.
Wasn't named Paul?
No, it was Ray and Jill were Paul and Paula. Ray Hildebrand and Jill Jackson.
Okay.
Why they're Paul and Paula, I don't care enough to go look up. So,
Okay.
Canadian disco band Line. Do you remember them?
No.
They had the hit #1 dance hit "Your Love" in 1981. Dennis and Denise LePage, but Dennis LePage passed away at the age of 74 of cancer.
I'm not familiar with that. No.
It's one of those ones that if you were ever in a disco or a dance hall, you might still hear sampled. I'll put it that way.
All right, I'll look it up.
Yeah. From the world of race car driving, we lost Bill Vukovich II, who was in the championship car division of USAC and kart, finished second 1 year in the series. More than anything, it's impressive that he lived to the age of 79, because his father, Bill Vukovich, who was Indianapolis 500 winner, won twice, died in a car crash. And his son, Billy Vukovich III, also died in a car racing crash. So the fact he lived out his natural life at the age of 79 is kind of amazing. Vukovich was a member of the National Midget Racing Hall of Fame, which is midget cars, not the inappropriate term for Oompa Loompas.
That's where I was going in my head.
Yes, I knew it was. Also passed away George Montgomery, a member of who won the NHRA national title several times, passed away at the age of 80. And member of the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America, member of the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame as well. It's always weird when race car drivers live long enough to die of old age.
Honestly, as weird as it sounds, yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah. From the Olympics, James Parker, American track and field athlete, or hammer thrower, representing the U.S. in Summer Olympics, won a silver at the Pan American Games, passed away at the age of 47. I don't know from what. But he passed away, as well as Tom Courtney, 2 gold medals in the 1956 Olympic Games, 800 meters in Melbourne, and the 4x400 as well. He made it to the age of 90. Died in a assisted care facility. So I think that is it for my Olympians. Yep. So from the world of football, well, actually, I'll come back to football. Let's do baseball first. Here's a name you might remember. Alex Cole died. Former center fielder for the Twins, Red Sox, Rockies, Pirates, and Indians in the 90s.
Alex Cole?
Alex Cole, yeah.
No, I don't know that name.
Okay. Well, he played for the Red Sox, so I thought he was a pretty good player. He played for us in 96 and then was released midway through the season. I always liked him particularly when he was with the Twins. But he had passed away at the age of 57. He would have been 58. He passed away on the 11th. He would have been 58 on the 17th. So he passed away at 57. From the world of wrestling, we have a couple people we need to talk about. But let's do football first. So Carl Cornell passed away. Romeo Cornell's younger